Yes, I can, Your Honor.
Okay, great. Looks like everyone's here then, and we're ready to proceed, I think. Ms. Riggs, you may ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Senator McKissick, with respect to the amendments offered by you and your colleagues, did you have enough time to research the universe of amendments that might have been made during the Senate Bill 824 legislative process that could have been ameliorative?
No, not at all. I mean, there was very, very little time. I mean, from the time I saw the bill until the time it literally passed out of the Senate, I don't think it was more than a day and a half. There wasn't time to go back to see what other states might have done in terms of best practices or models so that we could really draft legislation that would mitigate the adversities that the legislation would have on people who did not have IDs. I mean, I would have welcomed the opportunity to have conducted that type of thorough, exhaustive research, but literally there was no time whatsoever available to do it.
Senator McKissick, I'd like to show you what's been marked as PX 136, which is a page from the official website of the South Carolina Election Commission. Reading down, I'm going to let Ashley scroll in. Do you see the sentence where it indicates that free voter ID can be obtained on election day? What's in the
Objection. Objection, Your Honor. I would again object that this is really now going beyond the scope of rebuttal. This is information that plaintiffs could have introduced in their case in chief. Senator McKissick is now going to be providing testimony that their other witnesses could have provided and is cumulative of that. And because he was not disclosed as a witness, we of course have had no opportunity to depose him on any of these views. Which, you know, we would have done had they appropriately identified him in these exhibits before trial.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, during legislative defendants' case in chief, they selectively waived legislative privilege to show a draft of the bill indicating that in support of their argument that Senate Bill 824 was allegedly designed after South Carolina's R54. This testimony is specifically to rebut two things: arguments that the Senate Democrats selectively offered amendments, and that the bill was in fact not based on R54 from South Carolina.
The objection is sustained.
Senator McKissick, did you know that the South Carolina voter ID law upon which Senate Bill 824 was allegedly based offers free IDs at the County Board of Elections?
No, I did not know that they allow for that type of provision. There's a lot that I did not know at that time. I mean, I submitted an amendment, and one of the things that my amendment did was, you know, extend the, I guess would have been the life of these new voter IDs that were being issued by the state of North Carolina. As I recall, it went from 8 years up to 10 years. I did not know at that time that South Carolina didn't have any life in terms of an expiration date on their IDs. And really, I could not understand in the process of what we were doing why any voter ID needed to expire. And in fact, I was so concerned about this expiration that one of the provisions in my amendment essentially stated that, you know, you got to send out a notice at least 90 days in advance to let somebody know it is expiring. And I'm still to this day not sure why you have to have these expiration dates, or why, if you had an expired driver's license, you couldn't use that as a form of ID. I mean, that would have been a wonderful thing to have done, but I think we only did that in the bill for people who were 65 or older, if my recollection served me correctly. So, I mean, there was a lot I was unaware of and did not know.
And to be clear, Senator McKissick, if you had known that South Carolina offered free photo IDs on election day, would you have offered an amendment to that effect?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it would have been wonderful to be able to get there on election day and to actually get an ID issued if you met whatever standards might have been for obtaining one. I mean, being able to obtain one on election day makes a lot of sense. I don't know why you'd want to cut off the time frame.
And to be clear, if you had known that South Carolina County Board offered free IDs had no expiration date, would you have offered an amendment to remove the expiration date entirely?
Absolutely, without a doubt, unequivocally. I mean, I would have had no reason not to have done that because that would have made this far less burdensome and impactful upon people who did not have IDs. I mean, anything we could have done to increase access to IDs would have been, in my mind, fitting and appropriate.
Senator McKissick, with more time during the legislative process of Senate Bill 824, would you have done this research and made those amendments accordingly?
Absolutely, without a doubt. I would have done research. I would have found out what was going on in terms of legislation in other states. I would have tried to draft amendments that would have appropriately put us in line with having perhaps the best laws that have been least intrusive and impactful among people who did not have IDs. I mean, it would have been a logical, reasonable, thoughtful, and appropriate thing to have done, but there's no time to do it when you get the bill and they're getting ready to vote it out of committee one day and vote it on the floor. I mean, it's you don't have time to go out there and conduct research. I did not think when the constitutional amendment was passed that we were going to be called back to deal with this in November or right after Thanksgiving and before Christmas. I reasonably thought we'd be coming back in the long session to deal with the enabling authority related to the constitutional amendment, as we've done in other occasions with other constitutional amendments in the past. I mean, that's the way we've handled it. We've come back in the long session or whatever the next legislative session was to address those issues. And I can think of at least two of those examples.
Senator McKissick, did you acknowledge that some kind of voter ID law would be needed to be enacted in order to comply with the Constitution?
Absolutely.
Did the
There's no doubt.
Did the process by which Senate Bill 824 was enacted allow you to balance your obligation with the new constitutional amendment and also comply with all other respects of the North Carolina Constitution?
It didn't allow me an opportunity to do so.
Senator McKissick, are you aware in deposition and in testimony in this case, former Senator Joel Ford swore under oath that you told him you were happy with Senate Bill 824?
I'm aware that he made that statement, but that is not a statement I ever suggested, stated, or implied to him at any time.
Were you happy with Senate Bill 824?
No, I was sorely disappointed with the bill. I mean, it was marginally better than what got passed back in 2013. I believe that was HB 589 back then. So there were some improvements. It wasn't like that massive voter suppression bill that got stricken down by the courts for all the things that it did. But, this was not the ideal bill to provide the enabling authority that we needed to provide in this state. So I had deep reservations and concerns about it, and I expressed that to those who I chatted with. So I don't know why Senator Ford would have been under the impression that I was somehow happy and content with this bill. I mean, I would have liked to have seen a bill that I could have been happy and content with, but this was not that bill.
Were your reservations about Senate Bill 824 in any way related to the impact it would have on voters of color?
Absolutely. I mean, all the data which I had seen suggested there were probably upwards to about 300,000 people or so that would be adversely impacted, and low wealth individuals and disproportionately African-American voters and voters of color. And, that's profound. That's significant. Those are people who you want to continue to see exercise that privilege. I mean, I've been getting people registered to vote since I was a young person, and seeing the exuberance in people's faces when they voted for the first time, and the hope that represents to people when they're voting on a candidate of choice. And I would have wanted to do nothing that would have stopped those type of people from getting out to the polls and voting because they did not have the requisite type of ID that was necessary for them to continue voting.
Thank you, Senator McKissick. I have no further questions.
All right, cross-examination, Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Senator McKissick. For the record, my name is Nicole Moss, and I'm one of the attorneys representing the legislative defendants. It's nice to meet you virtually. I have
Good
a
to
few
meet you as
questions.
well.
Thank you. I have a few questions for you. Were you aware last week that when Mr. Ford testified, that he considers you to be a gentleman and of high character?
No, I was not aware that he had testified and made words and stated and expressed words to that effect.
And it doesn't surprise you to learn that Mr. Ford believes you to be a gentleman and of high character, right?
I appreciate that he has that observation of me.
Okay. And do you in turn share the same view of Mr. Ford, that he is a gentleman?
I respect Senator Ford. I mean, we as I say, we've had a cordial, respectful relationship over the years. So I mean, you know, I respect Joel.
And he likewise, were you aware, testified that he respects you?
I was not aware, but it's good to hear that he has the same respect.
And he testified that even though your recollection differs about the conversations you may have had, he acknowledges your good faith effort to recall those conversations and to relay them as you believe they are true. Do you in turn agree that he, in good faith, is trying to recall those conversations himself?
I don't really know what his thoughts were. To be candid with you, if I were him, I would have been very leery and skeptical about expressing what somebody else thought. Because I don't really know what's in another person's brain or in their head. And unless there was a specific expression, then I would not have reached that conclusion. And I certainly would not do that on behalf of others that I know. I try to stay away from what people think because you don't always know what they think.
And Mr. Ford rejected the idea that you are a liar. Do you reject the suggestion that he is a liar and would lie under oath?
I am always reserved about using the term liar. A lie, in my mind, is an intentional misrepresentation that's being made perhaps for a specific purpose or outcome. With Joel, he could have been simply mistaken. Maybe he's just simply mistaken. I don't really know. And that's why I don't try to cast aspersions upon him. I just think his recollections are flawed, solely flawed. I mean, you know, we sat next to each other, but I might have spent more time talking to him about his daughter than I might have about this particular bill.
And you're aware that Mr. Ford authored an op-ed in the Charlotte Observer regarding his support for Senate Bill 824, correct?
I have some recollections of that, but I don't remember the contents of the op-ed that he wrote. Just that one was written at some point in time. So I do not have direct recollections of the contents of that op-ed.
If Mr. Ford said in that op-ed that, and I'm quoting from him, "When I decided to support this bill, my late grandmother came to mind. I asked myself whether she would have been able to vote under this legislation, and she would." Do you believe that Mr. Ford was being sincere in his statement?
Objection, Your Honor. This goes beyond the scope of the rebuttal. Senator McKissick, was brought on to rebut Senator Ford's testimony to this court that Senator McKissick told him he was happy with this bill. What Senator Ford says in an op-ed that he didn't even write is beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
The objection is sustained, but not necessarily for the grounds that Ms. Riggs has stated.
Senator McKissick, do you believe that Mr. Ford would support a racially discriminatory law?
I cannot speak to what Senator Ford would do or why he would do it. That's beyond my ability to know. I think, as I stated earlier, I can't get into what's in people's minds. So I cannot express an opinion on what Senator Ford's motives may or may not have been.
Are you aware of any other laws that you contend were racially discriminatory that Mr. Ford sponsored during his time in the Senate?
Objection, again, beyond the scope of the rebuttal.
The objection's overruled. You can answer that one.
I would really have to sit back and look at the bills that Senator Ford voted on during the time that he was there, and to look at the breadth and depth of the contents and issues that legislation addressed. So unfortunately, without looking at a list of those bills and the numbers and thinking back about things, it would be difficult to answer this question in a way that would be appropriate.
In your time in the North Carolina Senate, you also served with Senator Don Davis, is that correct?
Yes,
And you served with Senator Ben Clark, is that correct? And Senator Davis was caucusing with the Senate Democrats in the fall of 2018, is that right?
yes, as I
And
recall.
likewise, I'm sorry.
Yes, as I recall, that would be correct.
And likewise, Senator Clark was caucusing with the Senate Democrats in the fall of 2018, is that right?
That is correct.
And Senators Clark and Davis were also caucusing with the Black Legislative Caucus when Senate Bill 824 was under consideration, is that right?
They were members of the North Carolina Legislative Black Caucus. We did not really have what I would call caucus meetings, except to deal with just kind of general caucus affairs, you know. But yeah, they were both active in both the Senate Democratic Caucus and in the North Carolina Legislative Black Caucus.
And Senator Davis at one point served as an officer for the Black Legislative Caucus, is that right?
Yes, I believe he did. Mm-hmm.
Now, based on your experience with Senator Davis, would Senator Davis vote for a law with the purpose of increasing the electoral success for Republicans in the General Assembly?
Senator Davis represents a very unusual district. It's a district that could easily elect a Republican, as well as it could elect a Democrat. So it's kind of a swing type of district. And in fact, he lost his seat back in 2010. And he did come back after that. Was it 2010? No, maybe. I think it was 2010. Yes, he lost. And then he came back after lines and boundaries were redrawn to the legislative district. So he's from a very unusual district where his potential voters are looking at him in a unique way compared to some other districts in the state. And I simply say that because that, I believe, influences his votes on a number of issues as it relates to optics that might enhance his ability to be reelected.
So in your experience with those optics in mind, would Senator Davis vote for a law that had the purpose of restricting access to the vote by African Americans?
I think he would be more inclined to vote for a bill where perhaps the vote for the constitutional amendment in his district might have been higher than the 55%. I think the amendment got statewide, that was therefore requiring voter IDs, and try to appeal to his constituents in a way that would enhance his probability of being reelected, even though the optics may not always be what he might prefer
So are
among
you
his
sug-
African American voters. Yeah, I mean, among his African American voters, it might not have been an issue that was resonating well, and in terms of what he thought might have been great, but in terms of the other voters that he needed to get to support him to continue serving, it might very well have enhanced his standing. Does that make
So are-
sense?
Well, are you suggesting that Senator Davis would put political expediency over principle?
It would be a question you'd have to ask Senator Davis. I would not be in a position to answer that. But I think certainly political considerations come into play when you are getting reelected from a relatively tough district. It's hard to, you got to think about the way issues resonated with the voters in that particular district. So his vote might have been a bit out of sync in terms of what you might intuitively thought or expected it to be in light of the issues that were presented by the voter ID enabling legislation.
And likewise, in your experience, would Senator Clark vote for a law with the purpose of restricting access to the vote by African Americans?
Again, you'd have to ask Senator Clark that question. I really can't speculate as to what his motivation would be unless he stood up to explain it, because there have been bills which he voted on, and when he explained his reason for voting on it, I was a little dumbfounded. For example, I remember there being one bill dealing with abortion rights that he voted against. And I thought, well, obviously he voted against it because it involves various restrictions or conditions. And when he stood up to explain his vote, he said he had voted against it because it allowed exceptions for cases dealing with rape and incest. He would have preferred not seeing, as a matter of law, those exceptions. I wouldn't have thought that was the reason he voted that way, but he stood up and explained it, so I accepted it.
And likewise, are you familiar with Representative Dwayne Hall?
Yes, I'm familiar with Dwayne Hall.
In your experience, would Representative Hall vote for a law that had the purpose of restricting access to the vote by African Americans?
Again, you'd have to really speak with former Representative, Dwayne Hall, in terms of what his thoughts or his opinions were. I could not really express that for him.
And
try to
are
get into
you,
other people's minds and second guess their motivation or their purpose for doing something that they have done.
and so you acknowledge and credit the fact that these representatives and senators could have reasons and motivations for doing something that you don't know.
Absolutely.
And you have no reason to doubt the good faith of Senator Davis.
No, I have no reason to doubt his good faith.
And same with Senator Clark.
When I use the term good faith or adopt that term that you've used, I'm adopting it to the extent to which I'm not questioning their judgment in terms of why they might have done something, but I still, express and consistently articulate, I can't get into their minds. I don't know what they did. They are good people who I respect, and I would leave it at that. I mean,
I'd like to turn now to your testimony regarding Democratic caucus strategy. Just so I'm clear with respect to the privilege that you waived, are you here speaking today on behalf of the Democratic caucus or on behalf of yourself?
On behalf of myself.
And so you're not providing this court with any testimony about what the Democratic caucus's strategy was. Is that right?
Could you repeat that question just to make sure I do understand it?
Sure. I want to make clear that you're not providing the court with any testimony about what the Democratic caucus's strategy was in responding to Senate Bill 824.
I am speaking on behalf of myself. Now, I was a member of the Senate Democratic Caucus, was generally aware of the thoughts that were expressed related to Senate Bill 824. So I'm generally aware of their thoughts, but I'm certainly not delegated to speak on their behalf, nor appointed in any respect to speak on their behalf as their spokesperson or representative.
And you're not waiving the Democratic caucus's and the members of that caucus's privilege to where you can tell us what the Democratic caucus's strategy was, correct?
I'm not waiving anybody's privilege. I don't think I'm empowered to waive their privilege.
And so in terms of whether the Democratic caucus had a strategy of limiting debate on Senate Bill 824 for litigation purposes, you can't speak to that because you're not speaking on behalf of the Democratic caucus, correct?
I can speak as to my perceptions as a caucus member, but not on behalf of the caucus. My perceptions as a member, I think I'm entitled to share, but I cannot speak on their behalf as a duly anointed or appointed representative, nor would I
Understood.
attempt to waive their privilege.
Well, to be clear, Senator McKissick, if you're going to be speaking about what you understood the Democratic caucus's strategy to have been, then I'm going to be asking you what that opinion is based upon. Are you prepared to tell me today what your conversations within the Democratic caucus were and what your opinions about their strategy is based upon?
Objection. I think that's asked and answered badgering, and his perceptions. I mean, Senator Ford testified about the purpose of a caucus he wasn't even a member of. Senator McKissick has principally stated that he is speaking on behalf of a caucus that he led, but only speaking for, sorry, he is speaking as a member of a caucus he led. I think this line of questioning is inappropriate. And I would object.
Your Honor, if I may briefly respond, I'm simply trying to understand, I am trying to respect the privilege that that Senator McKissick is asserting. And if he is speaking and he's going to be offering his views and perceptions, I believe I'm entitled to inquire into the basis for that and not to have to take that at face value. If he's asserting privilege, I respect that and I won't ask those questions, but I don't believe that plaintiffs should be able to have it both ways, where they put on a witness who's going to speak about something and then I'm not able to inquire behind it.
Your Honor, may I be heard just very briefly?
Yes.
Your Honor, Senator Ford testified on behalf of what the caucus's strategy did and would not answer or produce documents relating to other members' testimony. This was legislative defendants' principle they outlined with with former Senator Ford. Plaintiffs aren't trying to have it both ways. We are absolutely following the rules and the guidelines that legislative defendants set with former Senator Ford, and Senator McKissick is answering honestly and to the best of his ability. He has not waived that privilege. He should be allowed to testify consistent with the way former Senator Ford did.
The objection is sustained.
Senator McKissick, is it your understanding that the Democratic caucus decided what amendments to offer on the Senate floor to Senate Bill 824?
I believe that individual senators decided which amendments they chose to run based upon their thoughts about what needed to be changed in the bill to make it a better bill.
Are you familiar with Senator Robinson?
Yeah, Gladys Robinson, yes.
And if she testified in her direct testimony that the caucus discussed the fact that the amendments that were offered on the Senate floor were those that were agreed to in caucus, would you disagree with that?
I would not disagree with that. But again, they were amendments that would have been drafted by individual members based upon their thoughts about what could be improved in the bill and perhaps generally summarize.
And
Since
if
each
she and
person can't always review every amendment, so they might have summarized what this might have done.
sure. And would you disagree with her if she testified that the reason she didn't offer amendments was that she was not selected to do so?
I don't know about Senator Robinson's statement on that behalf. I don't think anybody had to be selected to run an amendment. Generally, you know, if there were amendments addressing issues of concern, unless the amendments might have been redundant with what another member had already proposed to offer, generally people were free to run whatever amendments they chose to do so. So, you know, I that might have been her perception, but I don't think she would have been excluded from running something, an amendment she felt strongly about, unless it was redundant.
Have you ever considered potential litigation when deciding how to approach a bill that you oppose?
No,
Do you know if any of your Democratic colleagues have?
I could not speak on their behalf.
Do you know whether Democratic senators considered litigation strategy in opposing House Bill 589?
I'm not aware of any litigation strategy that was discussed in terms of, you know, Senate Bill. Oh, wait a minute, which Senate Bill number did you say? Go back and repeat the
House
bill
Bill
number. I can make sure.
And I'll take that chance to offer an objection relating to an exceeding the scope of the rebuttal. We only talked about Senate Bill 824, not House Bill 589.
That's why I was trying to get straight to bill number 2 after I was starting to answer.
But hold on, I made an objection.
Yes.
Sustained.
Now, Senator McKissick, I'm going to walk you through some of the amendments and proposed amendments to Senate Bill 824. If we could bring up Joint Exhibit 645. Can you see that on your screen, Senator?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
An
And
amendment
this-
by Senator Ford.
Correct. And this amendment had the effect of making voter photo identification cards available during early one-stop voting. Is that right?
It says, except during the period between the end of one-stop voting for a primary and election day. So I guess what they're saying is if one-stop voting ends perhaps on that Saturday, and election day is that next Tuesday, that they won't issue IDs between that Saturday that voting ends and the Tuesday that would be election day, which would be contrary from what I understand they were doing down in South Carolina, where you could get an ID all the way up to election day.
And Senator McKissick, my question to you was, this amendment had the effect of making voter photo identification cards available during one-stop early voting. You agree with that, correct?
It would appear to do so. I'm
And
just, you know, I don't have the whole bill to fit this amendment into, but that it would appear that up through the end of one-stop voting, you could get an ID. That's what it appears to state, but not after one-stop voting ends before election day.
And you voted for this amendment, correct?
I don't recall.
If we could have a moment, I'm going to bring up the roll call vote on that, on Amendment 1. So give me one moment. Let's see. And just apologize, I'm looking for the right exhibit to call up for you. We may not have already made this an exhibit. Okay, so Senator, I'm not finding the exhibit I want to show you, so I'll move on for that. But you don't recall whether you voted for this amendment, is that right?
No, I don't. And of course, when I'm looking at an amendment, you know, here in isolation without seeing how it fits into what was preceding this statement and was after this statement in the original bill, I'm really trying to dissect it without having appropriate and total context. But as I stated earlier, it would appear to, you know, basically allow for voter IDs to be issued during the one-stop voting period. I don't know if the original bill did not allow that. Um, and likewise, it seems to end it on that Saturday. That would typically be where one-stop voting would end, preceding the, you know, the general election the next Tuesday. So I mean that's what it appears to do. And you know, as I stated, I think if you could get voter IDs issued right up to the day of the election, that would be outstanding. So it would certainly have been great if it had been broader and more expansive.
But you agreed that offering County Board of Election ID, new voter IDs by the County Board of Election is an excellent way of moving forward, correct?
I think that being able to get IDs other than the Department of Motor Vehicles is a good idea because people can't even get into DMV to get these ID cards. They have to get appointments that sometimes takes weeks, and they're open only during limited hours. So it did increase accessibility by them being issued by county boards of election. At the same time, county board of elections typically close by 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It would be great to know that county boards of elections were actually getting out to precincts where people might vote, to get the people coming there to get their IDs. Been nice if they could have gone out to community events to have done so, or gone out to the community centers. If they could have done it during what I would call non-traditional 8:30 to 5:30 or 9 to 5 hours in the evening hours when people are not at work, or places that are more accessible by public transit. There's a lot more that could have been done, notwithstanding the fact that we had a new outlet and opportunity through our county boards of elections. We could have gone further to broaden, enhance, and increase accessibility to these IDs for people who were going to need them.
But nevertheless, at the time when this amendment passed, you indicated that you thought it was an excellent way of moving forward, correct?
I don't recall exactly what I said. It was several years ago.
Okay, let's bring up JX 772. And let's go to page 49. And if you look at line 12, well,
Yes, I see it there.
this is you speaking here.
Okay.
And you state on the floor of the Senate, one of the things which the bill allows for is the new voter IDs, which we offer by the county boards of election. I think that's an excellent way of moving forward. That was your statement on the floor of the Senate during the second reading of the bill, correct?
Yes, I would agree. That was my statement because it was an additional outlet other than Department of Motor Vehicles offices to get equivalent to an ID.
And when the Senate and the senators who voted for this amendment adopted it, they were not doing that in an attempt to limit the forms of ID that would be available for voters, were they?
No.
Let's look now at Amendment 2 to Senate Bill 824, JX 644. Are you familiar with this amendment that was offered by Senator Daniel?
Let me take a minute to read it.
Sure.
Yes, I'm familiar with the concept of a reasonable impediment declaration form.
And Senator Daniel, he was one of the primary sponsors of Senate Bill 824, correct?
That is correct.
And he ran this amendment to correct an issue that you were concerned about, which involved circumstances and standards under which a voter without an ID could sign a reasonable impediment declaration form, which would allow them to vote without an ID. Is that correct?
I may well have had some conversations with him that led him to introduce this. That's entirely possible.
And what were the nature of your communications with Senator Daniel about Senate Bill 824? Oh,
Yeah,
Uh,
objection. I'm pretty sure the legislative defendant's position is that Senator Daniel has not waived his legislative privilege. If he has, that's news to us.
I didn't ask what the specific conversations were. I asked what the nature of them were.
The objection is sustained.
Now, the Senate adopted this amendment that Senator Daniel offered. Is that right?
as I recall, that is correct.
And you voted for this amendment?
As I recall, that is
Let's
correct.
now-
I mean, go ahead. Mhm.
No, I'm sorry. Please finish your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think offering reasonable impediment declaration forms is an enhancement for ability for people to be able to use it. The challenge and problem with these forms is that many people don't know that they exist. They don't know that they can ask for one. And then sometimes a person who reviews a form like this doesn't even understand it and know what box they should check. So while it is good and helpful to some particular subgroup of voters that may not have an ID, it still has challenges in the way that it can be exercised because people, I mean, the term reasonable impediment declaration form, I don't know many people who would go into a precinct and be able to express that term of art and get the form and be able to decipher or understand its contents completely and use it perhaps in a way that would enhance their opportunities to vote. But yes, it is a option that should be offered without a doubt.
Senator McKissick, you are not an expert in implementation of election laws, right?
No, I am not.
And you do not know, and you have not reviewed how the State Board of Elections intends to implement the reasonable impediment process, correct?
Objection beyond the scope of the rebuttal testimony.
Your Honor, this is directly in responsive to the narrative that Senator McKissick just provided.
Overruled.
I do not have knowledge that has been presented relating to the way they plan or intend to use the form. I am basing it upon my experience just in terms of getting out to precincts on election day and meeting people who are waiting in line to vote, and the general perceptions that I have about what those voters in all probability might be able to express if they did not have a voter ID and needed to use this type of form.
Okay. And you have no way to know whether the State Board of Elections is going to require someone to have to request a reasonable impediment declaration when they go to vote, correct?
That would be correct.
Let's look now at JX 636, Amendment A10. This is a copy of the amendment that you offered to Senate Bill 824, correct?
Yes, it is.
And you drafted this amendment?
That is correct.
Okay. And you voted for this amendment, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And the Senate voted to adopt this amendment?
Yes, that is correct.
And as a result of this proposal, you were able to obtain bipartisan support for an amendment to the bill that extended the expiration date of new voter identification cards from 8 to 10 years, correct?
That is correct. I mean, of course, I would have preferred if it had no expiration date.
And you could have proposed that had you wanted to, correct?
That is correct.
The amendment also requires county boards of elections 90 days before a voter ID would expire to send out a notice to the registered voter at the address they have that says the ID is going to expire in 90 days, correct?
That is correct.
And this notice would put somebody on guard and let people understand that it's time to go out there and to renew that ID, because the people holding them are not going to be your typical people with driver's licenses and other forms of ID that would be traditionally acceptable, correct?
That is correct. I mean, assuming that they are still in the same address and they receive the notice, you know, that's what you have to hope. You don't really know if that's going to occur or not.
And your amendment also extended the exception to the ID requirement for a natural disaster from 60 to 100 days of an election, correct?
That is correct. And the reason I put it there was that I thought that there might be times when there was a hurricane or tornado or whatever the natural disaster might be, where people wouldn't even have access to documents that would help them to obtain a voter ID, or for that matter, documents that might, help them do anything. And they might be, so I mean, I thought those were reasonable things that could be done that were politically feasible. And I have to emphasize politically feasible, because I could have introduced a whole lot of things that might not have been politically feasible. So you mitigate damages. It still were 824 had a long way to go before I could support it.
Understood, but you also recognize that the supermajority Republican General Assembly could have passed Senate Bill 824 without accepting a single amendment from a Democrat, correct?
That is correct.
You didn't consider this amendment that you proposed, Amendment 10, to be inconsequential or simple, did you?
I considered it an amendment that would mitigate the potentially adverse impacts that the enabling authority created, and the potential adverse impacts on voters who did not have IDs today. So I thought it would be helpful. I thought it would benefit some group of people. And with the expiration date being extended, yeah, I mean, people aren't even used to having an ID card that is issued by a board of elections that expires. So if it's going to expire, you at least need to provide people notice.
Right. But again, you could have offered an amendment that said that those boards of election free IDs would have no expiration date, correct?
Yeah, I didn't know that was the way it was in some jurisdictions. It would have been nice to have known it, because I would have had a basis for stating to those who needed to be open to my amendment that there was a credible, verifiable basis for eliminating those expiration dates. I didn't know what was going on in other jurisdictions like South Carolina as related to the fact that they did not have expiration dates. So, I mean, you try to, in politics, come up with what is politically feasible and doable. And I believe I would have faced opposition had I sought to eliminate an expiration date in its entirety. And then you would have gotten nothing, and you'd been stuck with where the bill originally started. So
Did you offer to any Republican senator the option of an amendment without an expiration date?
I don't recall doing so at the time. It seems like I do recall speaking with someone about, why do we need expiration dates at all?
But as we sit here today and you're testifying under oath to the court, is there a single senator that you can point to that you told, I would prefer to have this amendment not have expiration dates?
I did not know at that time what South Carolina was doing. I do recall having a conversation with one senator about not having expiration dates. And the response I received at that time is that people might look really different if they come in there to vote. And that, some type of limitation was needed in that person's mind. And that's about the extent of it. And I could not say anything more than that.
Let's look at JX 635 now. And this is Amendment 11 to Senate Bill 824 that was offered by Senator Clark, correct?
Yes, it was offered by Senator Clark.
And Senator Clark's amendment requires the State Board of Elections to prominently place the following statement in all voter education materials mailed to citizens and on informational posters displayed at one-stop sites and precincts on Election Day. Quote, that all registered voters will be allowed to vote with or without a photo ID card, end quote. And then it goes on from there, correct?
Let me take a minute and read it real quickly, because I don't see any end quote until the very end, and there's a lot of language after then.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty lengthy quotation.
Right. And you voted for this amendment, correct?
As I recall.
And when you voted for this amendment, did you understand it to accurately describe Senate Bill 824 when it says that all registered voters will be allowed to vote with or without a photo ID card?
Well, I mean, it goes on to state, when voting in person, you will be asked to present a valid photo ID card. If you do not have a valid photo ID card, you may obtain one from your county boards of election prior to the election through the end of the early vote period. So I mean, it goes on. It's a pretty lengthy statement, which, while it's great if you got somebody who has the time to read it and it's prominently displayed, will explain something to you, but a lot of voters aren't going to be looking at a wall of a precinct on election day and reading this type of verbiage and understand exactly what it meant.
Well, again,
I mean,
Senator McKissick, you don't know what's going to be on the wall at a precinct on Election Day, do you? We have
Well, it
established you
says-
are not an expert in the implementation of this law. So my question is simply, is this what the law says, not how is the law going to be implemented? Do you agree that this is what the law says?
I agree that the law says it's going to be prominently placed the following statement on, voter education materials mailed to citizens and informational posters displayed at one-stop voting sites and precincts on election day. That's where I'm gathering my information from. The first sentence, the first full and complete sentence in the amendment.
And you voted for this amendment, correct?
Yes, I believe I did.
And in addition to the amendments we have discussed, there were two other amendments to Senate Bill 824 that were adopted on the floor of the Senate, correct?
I don't recall the exact number, but I mean, I'm sure you can refresh my recollections with the other ones. I mean, I don't recall what the other ones were. I mean, it's been quite a few years.
Well, you voted in favor, the other amendments that were offered and adopted on the Senate floor, you voted in favor of them, right?
I don't recall. I'm just being honest with you. I don't recall my votes that day on the host of amendments. I remember there being an awful lot of amendments that were just tabled. I mean, they got introduced, they were tabled, nobody got a chance to vote on anything. And they tabled them because they did not want to have a record of people voting against the idea that was being presented by the amendment. So the smart thing Republican majority do is to table it so their members don't have to vote on an amendment that'd be difficult to explain why they voted against it. So they table it. So I mean, I just don't have perfect recall of the number of amendments introduced.
You don't dispute the official record regarding what amendments were adopted and which ones you voted for, correct?
No, I do not.
Well, let's talk about the Democratic amendments that the Senate voted to table. Let's bring up, if we could, JX 640.
Okay, it looks like these are the kind of dealing HAVA documents.
Right, so this is an amendment that was introduced by Senator Clark, correct?
Yes.
And this amendment was tabled, is that right?
If you say so,
Okay.
again, I don't have perfect recollection. I would not debate, yes, it says table at the top. Yes, you're correct.
And you were not caucusing with the Republicans, correct?
No,
And you don't know why anyone who voted to table this amendment voted to table it, correct?
I know what the traditional procedural maneuvers were within the Senate chamber exercised by the majority on many bills, not just this bill. I mean, the idea was they tabled things they didn't want their folks to vote on. That was a way of killing it.
Right. But you can't speak to whether or how any senator who voted to table this amendment, why they voted the way they did, correct?
I cannot speak for their purpose except to say that they were probably following the directions of the Senate Republican caucus and Senate leadership.
And do you know that for a fact, or are you speculating?
I have every reason to believe, based upon past practice that I have observed consistently since they came to power in 2011, is that was the way they functioned and operated.
Let's look at JX 639 now, if we can.
Yeah, it was by Senator Van Dyne.
Okay.
I can't really tell what it was doing except changing the date from May 1st, 2019 to July 1st, 2019, and substituting some other dates.
Mhm.
So
This
without
amendment,
context, I don't know what what it actually did.
so if I represent to you that this amendment would have delayed the date on which county boards of election were required to make free voter IDs available, that is not something you would support, correct?
Can you explain again? I mean, it'd be helpful to actually have the bill and understand what Senator Van Dyne was attempting to do.
Well, you voted in favor of tabling this amendment, correct?
I don't recall. I've stated consistently, I don't recall how I voted on these amendments. I mean, I can see it was tabled, but I don't remember it at all.
If the
And this is
record,
really hard to,
now, if the record shows that you voted in favor of tabling this amendment, that would have been because you thought that was appropriate, correct?
I just want to object to make clear that the basis of this question was Ms. Moss's representation of the meaning of an amendment that the witness testified he cannot confirm because of the lack of context.
I don't know, is that an objection or just a statement for the record, Ms. Riggs?
It's an objection. I think she's mischaracterizing the testimony and misleading the witness. Lack of foundation.
Okay. The objection is sustained.
Can we bring up JX 668, please? And Senator McKissick, this is the roll call vote for the amendment that was tabled that we were just discussing, which is Amendment 7 to Senate Bill 824. And do you see, according to this official document, that you voted in favor of tabling that amendment?
if this is related to that particular amendment, it would appear that I voted in favor of tabling it, but to be completely candid with you, I'm still not 100% sure what the amendment did. I just don't know exactly what it did. I don't know if it was something that I saw as being problematic with what it did, or in a worst case situation, I guess hit the wrong button.
And Senator Ford also voted in favor of tabling this amendment. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if we could bring up JX 638. And this is Amendment 8 to Senate Bill 824 that was tabled. Do you recognize this one?
No. I haven't looked at this stuff in years.
And Senator McKissick, excuse me, you were asked on direct about your statements on the floor of the Senate. And if I understood your testimony correctly, you explained that you were just being courteous when you made those statements. Is that right?
That is correct. I always try to be courteous and respectful of colleagues, particularly if they had accepted some amendment that I made to a bill. It was a common courtesy that I extended on many occasions.
So let's look at JX 772 at page 48.
Okay.
And if we start at line 12, you said at the time on the floor of the Senate that I think the effort made to bring forth legislation that I see here today is an effort to try to expand it significantly beyond what it was when the last voter ID bill came before us, which was actually stricken down by the courts as being unconstitutional. Were you being sincere when you made that statement?
I'm sure that my expression in that statement related to the fact that we at least did not have what I refer to the voter suppression legislation that was reflected in House Bill 589 that was passed back in 2013. That was absolutely egregious in many respects. So yes, this was a bill that was better than 589, but 589 was atrocious. I mean, it eliminated Saturday voting. It went in there and basically stopped, 16, 17-year-olds from pre-registering to vote. As I recall, it said if you went and voted in the wrong precinct, that you were allowed to do so, but your vote wouldn't be counted. It was the first effort of putting some type of voter ID bill into effect in North Carolina. So it was absolutely, totally egregious. So yes, this was an improvement beyond that egregious House Bill 589 that had been adopted back in 2013. So it was better. It was
You were
better than that bill.
acknowledging, sorry,
Yeah,
please.
yeah, it was better than what we had been offered before. But I mean, that did not make this a good bill.
And you were acknowledging that Senate Bill 824 was not House Bill 589, correct?
That is correct. I'm sure that was the context of my remark on that occasion.
Okay. And you also made comments on the floor during the third reading, correct?
I don't recall.
Okay. Well, let's bring up JX 773 at page 3, which is the transcript from the third reading. And here you said during the third reading, Senator McKissick, you said, "I'd just like to say thank you to Senator Daniel and Senator Krawiec for their work on the bill and for being open and inclusive and listening to us on the other side of the aisle in trying to come up with something that is reasonable in terms of its approach. So I want to thank you for that effort." That is what you said at the time when the bill was being passed, correct?
That is correct. It was a polite and courteous gesture that I was making, particularly in contrast to House Bill 589, how egregious it had been. It was better than what we had dealt with back then. And certainly, you know, it was an improvement from 589. It was not nearly as burdensome and egregious um, as it could have been.
And Senator McKissick, are you in the habit of describing the process for enacting legislation that you view as having a racially discriminatory impact as open and inclusive?
I think what you have to look at was the context of my mind on that occasion. In retrospect, if I were to realize that my words would be scrutinized and put underneath a magnifying glass, I would have been best off saying nothing rather than extending the common courtesies that I typically extended to people on the other side of the aisle. What I found, it was good to have, you know, to be cordial and polite. I mean, I've never seen anything wrong with that in politics, rather than having complete negative discourse. You know, I think that's just the way I prefer to operate, but that's a reflection of me.
In 2013, when House Bill 589 passed the Senate, you did not thank any Republicans on the floor then, did you?
I would have had no reason to. It was egregious. I mean, it was when they went out there with that bill, it was within weeks of the U.S. Supreme Court um, undermining some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and they thought they could get all of these areas addressed in a ways that would pretty much solidify Republican domination and control of the General Assembly for many years to come. So they tried to get away with everything that they could, and they were successful in doing so until the courts struck it down, which was many years later. I mean, you know, the thing was out there for, oh my gosh, I don't want to say the number of years because I could be mistaken, but 4 or 5 years, I'd say.
And Senate Bill 824 was not that, correct?
824 was an improvement over 589. I will acknowledge that. Yes.
Okay. And Senator McKissick, you maintained a website when you were in the Senate. Is that right?
I had a website. You mean one that was for my campaign?
Yes, McKissickforNC.org.
That is a name that I utilize on a page. Mhm.
And you posted on that website views about Senate Bill 824, correct?
I don't recall.
Okay. If we could pull up LX 262. If we could, and it's small, so if we could zoom in on it on the, if you could go back up. Okay, if you could zoom in on, well, first of all, you are Floyd McKissick, correct?
That would be correct. Floyd B. McKissick Jr.
Okay.
I
And
have
if
a
we
son
scroll,
the third. Yeah, you know,
okay.
to
And
be
if we could,
exact.
gotcha. And if we could scroll down just a moment so you can see the actual, and we'll zoom in on it, the actual URL of the website at the bottom of that first page. And do you recognize that URL, McKissickforNC.org?
We did have something for McKissickforNC.org, but I did not update this personally or maintain it personally at all.
Would you have
So, I mean,
allowed something, I'm sorry, would you have allowed something to be posted to this website that you did not agree with?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Overruled.
I mean, there was a person who would routinely update the website on my behalf, but I frequently did not know what that person was actually uploading to the site.
Okay, but it was done on your behalf, and if you disagreed with it, you would have asked it to be taken off your website, correct?
To be candid with you, I seldom look at it. I seldom looked at my website at all. I had no reason to. So I didn't monitor it day in and day out or at any regular frequency. A person who was basically kind of a consultant just kind of kept that going in terms of having a presence.
And this consultant did this on your authorization, is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct. On my behalf. Mm-hmm.
So let's look at this particular posting to your website from 11/28/2018. It's a posting entitled "A Summary of North Carolina's New Voter ID Law."
Okay.
And this is a post about Senate Bill 824, is that right?
It appears to be, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me interject right here. I apologize. It's 11:45 and it's time for us to take our second morning break. So we're going to be in recess for about 15 minutes until 12 o'clock. All right, 12 o'clock.